to come up, and my consciousness was raised as a Latina, but thinking about how are these two groups intersecting? What are the intersections of history? And a lot of times when we think of Latin American countries, we think of the perpetrators who went there. But my focus now on the site has been refugees, Jewish refugees going to Latin America, which is a whole other topic. But also looking at the fact that during the Second World War, members of my family, my great uncles, they served in the military, they fought in the war, and one of them was captured and did not survive. And my grandmother worked in munitions factories. So I really started to think about the role that minorities played in World War II. And with that, even thinking about some of them who liberated some of the camps. But what came to us in Washington a few years ago was something that was really extraordinary, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a short PowerPoint to go over this very unique collection. And let me go right up here. Okay, so this was something that we did for Hispanic Heritage Month, but we're turning this into something that we hope will be useful for teachers and classrooms and for anybody who wants to expand on their knowledge of the Holocaust and the different intersections. So the Anthony Acevedo collection is what we're speaking about today. This is a picture of Anthony Acevedo in 1942. And so what we do at the museum is we collect evidence of the Holocaust. We call it rescuing the evidence because we are in a race against time. This is a history that is now 80 years old, more or less. And we are fighting Holocaust denial and Holocaust revisionism and distortion. And also we are losing our survivor generation and our witness generation as well. So wherever we can find documentation, collections, it could be a personal archive, a personal collection, all the way through the records of a particular country, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have worked at places in 6 of the 7 continents, finding collections. And so this particular collection really spoke to me in personal ways and built on that quest, that kind of personal quest that I had to look for intersections in this history between Jewish history, Latinx history, and the experiences of the Latinx community in the United States at the time, and if they were directly involved in what was happening in Europe. So on that note, Latinos, and I will use those terms interchangeably. We're starting to see the term Latinx used more and more, but still a lot of people use the term Latino, so I will refer to both of them. What was the experience of Latinos in World War II? As I mentioned, I have a personal experience or a personal connection, of course, not an experience. I wasn't around then, but my family was very much impacted by the war. My family was very much impacted by segregation in California. My mother was born in California and she was raised in California, and it wasn't until after the war that she moved to El Paso and then met my father. But her uncles and her oldest brother served in the military, even though they were subjected to a lot of racism, anti-Mexican sentiments. They couldn't live in certain neighborhoods in San Diego. They couldn't go to certain schools or certain places. You don't hear about that as much as you do with Black Americans, but this really did impact minorities all over the United States. And yet at the same time, many minorities served in the military as a way to really prove to people that they were as American as anybody else. So over 400,000 Latinos served in World War II. And that kind of service took on many different forms. So the picture that you see at the right is a picture of nurses, mostly female, as we see. They were from Puerto Rico. And we have to remember Puerto Rico was, by that time, a US territory. And there's more and more research being done on Puerto Ricans who served and fought in World War II. So I wanted to make light of that men and women from the Latinx community did quite a bit to support the United States during the war. And as I mentioned, 400,000 Latinos were in the military at that time. So moving forward, one of those was a young man named Anthony Acevedo, and he is the source of this collection. So Anthony Acevedo was born in Pasadena, California in 1923 to parents who were Mexican immigrants. And when Anthony was 13 years old, his family was subjected to what is euphemistically called the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals who were living here in the United States. And this history is one that really needs to be learned more and more. And it has been referenced in the media in the last 5 or 6 years with regard to the detention centers that are in cities along the border where families that have been separated are kept, and those are still running in many places. And oftentimes you see something about this history being spoken about. It's not something that is widely taught in schools, unfortunately, but hopefully we're going to help work to change that. So in 1929, with the start of the Great Depression and a very large anti-immigrant sentiment here in the United States that was informed by many things that were also happening in Europe, this program, even though it wasn't a formal federal program, this program called the Repatriation was enforced in cities where there were large and maybe not so large populations of Mexican Americans, many of whom were US born citizens, and family members who were maybe not born in the United States, but were living here. And what happened was, in a nutshell, they were encouraged, and in many cases forced, to go back to Mexico because they were seen as being a drain on jobs, even though many of them were US born citizens. And that is a whole other story, but it is part of Anthony Acevedo's story. So because his parents were repatriated and had to go back to Mexico, they were forced out of their homes and went back because they couldn't provide all the paperwork to show that they were here legally. They were here legally, and he was born here. They went to Mexico, to Durango, Mexico, and being a young boy, of course, he went with them as well. But due to selective service, he had to sign up for the draft, and he was drafted into the Army. And he very much wanted to serve in the Army. He wanted to serve for his country, even though he and his family had basically been deported from the country. He wanted to become a doctor, and he felt that joining the Army, he could start to receive training as a medic that would subsequently help him to go to school and become a doctor. So here we see, there's a picture of him in Durango. If you see it at the left, we can tell that that's Mexico because of the murals on the wall. And then here he is on the right when he's starting to receive his training as a medic through the Army. And these are all pictures that were donated and that are part of our collection from him. What happened with Mr. Acevedo was that he was taken as a prisoner of war during the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. But subsequently from there, he was one of 350 American prisoners of war who was selected to go to a concentration camp called Berga in Germany. It was a subcamp of the larger camp, Buchenwald. And he was subjected to horrific treatment, torture, starvation. But all through his captivity, he did something that was very rare. He was able to keep a diary in secret. And we have very few diaries that we know of in the world that were kept while somebody was in captivity. Well, we know about diaries like Anne Frank's diary that she kept in hiding. To keep a diary in captivity, and if you were caught, that could mean death in many cases. So the tragedy, among many of the tragedies in this story, was that even after they were liberated, those who survived, those American prisoners who survived this concentration camp experience at Berga, were not allowed, for various reasons, to speak out loud about what they had gone through. A large part of that was because Germany had become our ally in the Cold War. And also, there were other reasons as well. But it wasn't until 2000, in the early 2000s, that members of Congress got wind of these stories. And by then, so much time had passed that there would also be no kind of security threat or this leading to rupture between relations of the United States and Germany. So these stories started to come to light, including Mr. Acevedo's story. And one of the things about Mr. Acevedo that came to light was the fact that not only had he been denied the opportunity and the platform to tell what happened to him, but that he had this collection of names and photos and documents. And so in 2008, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, through my dear colleague and friend Kira Schuster, who Scott also knows, Kira is one of our curators, and she basically reaches out to anybody who might have a collection that they want to donate to the museum. So she reached out to the Acevedo family, to Mr. Acevedo and his family, and began a friendship, really, with them to earn their trust. And she and another colleague had told me the story about him because they knew of my interest in trying to find these connections between Latinos in the US and the Holocaust. And so this story to me was just really compelling, also because my family situation was very similar. Southern California, experiencing segregation, having family members who fought in the war and who were captured also as well, but did not survive. So this story very much resonated with me. And so after 2 years, in 2010, Mr. Acevedo came to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum with his family and presented us with his collection, including his diary, which you see him holding there in his hands. And that's a picture of Kira and I. This was in October 2010. Kira and I interviewed him, and we have his oral testimony on our website, mostly in English, and I did some of it in Spanish with him. A delightful man, just darling, darling man. He passed away 3 years ago. That was a tremendous personal loss of a friend and somebody who I kind of felt was like a family member. But we're very happy that we've continued the relationship with his family. We're actually working on a short animated film about him. And we're also working to use the actual diary itself in teacher training starting this summer. So some of the documents that we see in his collection are the photos, some of the photos that we showed you early on in the PowerPoint. This particular photo where he's in training as a medic, and this particular letter. And this letter is really striking because this is toward the end of the war. This letter was written in October of 1942. It's a letter from his father coming from Mexico, because keep in mind, even though his son is now going to serve in the army, the family is still living in Durango, Mexico, because they have been pushed out of the United States because they weren't able to provide all the legal papers to show that they were in the United States legally. So here he's basically giving permission for his son to serve in the Army and expressing the wish that his son has to train as a medic so that later on he could become a doctor. And there you see the stamp from Mexico, and you see Anthony Acevedo is a younger man, and his signature too on this document. So we have a range of documents about his life story at this time. Here we're moving forward into the war years. And this is a picture that was taken in the latter part of 1944 in Belgium, just before the Battle of the Bulge. So we're starting to see how, the consequences of war and the kinds of conditions that the troops are facing, especially as we go into winter. And especially as the war is winding down, and yet at the same time, the atrocities are still in full swing. So Mr. Acevedo began his diary at the end of 1944. He received it as part of a care package from the Red Cross because prisoners of war, and by this time he had been taken as prisoner of war, were allowed to receive care packages from abroad in many cases. So you can see this is the opening where he writes his name and saying that this belongs to him, and this is the front cover of his diary. What is extraordinary about his diary, and there are many things that I find of great value in it, is that as a medic, even though he's being starved and he's subjected to torture, he does everything that he can to continue to help his fellow prisoners of war, those who are wounded, those who are very ill. And the thing that I neglected to mention earlier is that the majority of the 350 American POWs who were sent to Berga, to this sub-concentration camp, were American Jewish men. And most of them were selected because they were Jewish, or they had Jewish sounding names, or the Germans perceived them to look Jewish, or because they looked to be racially inferior. So Mr. Acevedo, probably because of the fact that he was Latino, that he was a Mexican American, was selected as one of the prisoners to go to Berga. And so he keeps a list of his fellow prisoners who are ill and who are dying. And you can see here, he records their names, he records their prisoner number, and he records what it is that they are suffering from. And we were actually able to go back and look at this list and either find some of them who had survived or their family members. And since then, my colleague Kira has been able to collect even more records from prisoners in Berga due to the diary. And the way that he was able to keep this diary going was he only had one pen. And of course, it's not like you can go and get more when you're a prisoner of war. So he had to resort to different methods to keep a supply of ink in his pen, which I find to be just so incredible. He also in his diary sketches things that he's observing, because of course, and this is something that might be hard for our students today to understand because they're constantly taking pictures with their phones. He only could record what he was seeing by sketching. And so his diary is filled with different sketches. So this is his record of the slave labor that they were undergoing. And it was this particular illustration that decades later allowed Mr. Acevedo and some of the other survivors to receive compensation for their slave labor that they gave in Berga. What I find very striking is an educator on this history is how this diary, he doesn't really write much about the torture that he undergoes. And it wasn't until many years later that he could even speak about it. He did suffer from PTSD for the rest of his life. And he could not speak about everything that happened to him right away. it was over time that even his children were able to learn the full extent of what their father went through. But what I see in this diary are parts of what we call spiritual resistance. His way of trying to stay in touch with who he is as a person. And in his diary, he makes light of the fact that while he, as a practicing Catholic, is trying to observe Good Friday and Easter, his fellow POWs from the United States are trying to observe Passover. So he writes very, very, very sympathetically about how they're both trying to hold on to these traditions. But he also makes very ironic comments about how, both, during Yom Kippur, you fast, you don't drink water, you don't eat. And it's the same situation for those of us who are Catholic on Good Friday. But he makes this comment, well, we've been fasting since December, since they were taken to Berga. But what else he writes about is how he's thinking about his family celebrating Easter in Durango, and he's thinking about the cathedral there in Durango because his family is still in Mexico. They're not able to come back to the United States yet. They're not allowed to. And also in his diary, he sketches pictures of women, the pinups from the calendars that were so popular then. This particular sketch of this woman, she was the pinup woman of the year for 1944, I think it was. But his diary is just, it's so eloquent to me. And it also really tells us more about the experiences of American POWs. But it gives us this whole new lens on American prisoners of Nazi concentration camps, of German concentration camps, which you don't hear much about. And Mr. Acevedo, when he met with us in October of 2010 to bring his collection to Washington, D.C., he became the first person to register in our Holocaust Survivors Registry, the first Mexican-American Catholic to register as a survivor of Nazi persecution, because he went beyond being a prisoner of war to being a prisoner of an actual concentration camp. And so on that note, I want to just tell a little bit more about his story. He was liberated in May of 1945. He is able, because of his service, he's able to return to California. He goes on to become an engineer, actually, not a doctor. His relationship with his father was very difficult because his father had that kind of machismo that sometimes you see in certain cultures. His father really looked down on him for not fighting back, as if there was a way to fight back without being killed. And he had a very fraught relationship with his father for the rest of his life. But at the same time, he had a beautiful relationship with his own children. And there is a National Geographic documentary about Berga, and he's featured in it. And he goes back to Berga with his son, and he even speaks in Spanish to his father, kind of reprimanding his father, who's already been dead for several years, just kind of saying, look, look what I'm doing now, look at me now. It's a very moving documentary. Again, it's on Berga, and it's through National Geographic, who produced it. And you will see my colleague Kira in it. But it took so many decades, again, for these stories to be known and for his story to come to us. And when it did, as I said, it was a huge eye opener for us because of just what it reveals about captivity, what it reveals about spiritual resistance, what it reveals about another minority group and their struggles. And one of the things that is really poignant when you look at those men and women who served in World War II, who were able to return back home here to the United States, the ongoing struggle to be considered to be American citizens with full rights and liberties as an American. And And some of them took up the struggle in civil rights. Black Americans, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans. We don't always hear about all of those stories, but because so many of them were denied many rights, even after they had served their country, many of them became very vocal in that struggle. And Mr. Acevedo, in time, was able to speak out more toward the latter part of his life about this. So what we are doing now, related to Mr. Acevedo's personal history, is we have a crowdsourcing project called History Unfolded. And Scott knows very much about it, and so does Sandy and Eileen, who's here from Baltimore with our, from the Jewish Museum of Maryland, who's one of our Czech partners. History Unfolded is a project that the museum started in 2016. And this is what we call a citizen history project, where we have recruited individuals who enjoy doing research. We've recruited classrooms all the way from middle schools through colleges and universities. We've recruited independent scholars to help us find newspaper articles in their own communities, to go through their archives, either if they've been digitized and put online, or if they can go to their local library and research articles on microfiche, so that these articles are given to us. And it's helping us to create a database of newspaper articles from all over the United States, from small communities all the way through big cities like New York, Los Angeles, so that we have a better understanding of what Americans could have known at the time about what was happening in Europe with the growing Nazi threat all the way up through the end of the war. And what we do is we take particular historical themes of the Holocaust, such as Kristallnacht, such as the debate to go to the Olympics in 1936 in Berlin, the outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939. We give researchers, all you do is you go to this web address, newspapers.ushmm.org, and you can create an account, and it's all free. And you see a range of historical themes, and we give you keywords to look up, because at that time, the word Holocaust wasn't being used. Kristallnacht wasn't being used. So we also provide a way to look at newspapers and how people were reading newspapers back then. Because students today, we know many young people don't read print newspapers anymore. They read everything online or on their phone. But one of the topics that we recently added in the last year was to encourage researchers to help us find articles on the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals starting in late 1929 that went through the 1930s. And we have about 120 articles right now that have been submitted to us. And again, this intersects with Anthony Acevedo's personal history, being that he and his family were repatriated, and remember that's a euphemistic term, to Mexico when he was 13 years old. And he lived in Mexico until he was drafted into the Army. So what this also does is it helps us to understand attitudes toward minorities and immigrants at that time, and this somewhat pervasive mood in certain parts of the country, not only in the South, but also in the North and toward the West, toward a lot of minorities. It's been better documented, the experiences of Asian Americans, primarily Japanese Americans, and being interned in camps, especially out West. But we don't know, as I mentioned in the beginning, we don't know, or we're not taught as much about the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals, as much as we focus on other groups. And this is not to have any kind of competition. It's just that what I'm emphasizing here is that there is so much of this history that we still need to explore. And that is why the museum is devoted to finding these kinds of collections and encouraging people who have a collection at home, whether it's one artifact or it's a series of letters or it's a diary or whatever it might be, to consider donating them to the museum, where we can keep them, where we can use them, where we can make them available to scholars, because we have scholars from all over the world who are coming to the museum, even virtually, to do this kind of research. So hopefully in the next year or so, we will put out more information on what we find out about the repatriation through the articles that are submitted to us. And we will combine some of them with perhaps using Mr. Acevedo's diary in the classroom and how it can be used along with other diaries like Anne Frank's diary. So on that note, if you have any questions, or if you want to learn more about how we collect, or you have more any questions about the History Unfolded project, please feel free. It's better to email me right now. I'm not in my office. The museum just reopened this week, but we are still, most of us, working from home for the next 4 or 5 months. So with that, I will open it to questions if there's time. Scott?
Yes, there is. There's plenty of time we still have, and Kale is going to help with the questions.
Right.
We have such a nice small group. I would just invite you to take yourself on mute and ask. If you feel more comfortable typing it into the chat, I will feed it to Christina. You can listen to Pam's phone going off in the background.
Eileen, you have your hand up.
Yes, I learned so much. It's amazing. What happened to his family? Did they stay in Durango, or were they able to go back to
they were able to, yeah, they were able to go back to California. It wasn't right away. It was some years after the war. He was able to stay in the United States once he was liberated, and came back after he was treated, and was able to recover from the malnourishment and everything that he had experienced through the GI Bill. And that the GI Bill provided especially a lot of Latinos who had served, the opportunity to go to college. So that helped him. He married, he had 4 children, and the children are still in touch with us. But he and his first wife, they divorced, and then he married his second wife. She passed away just a few years before he did. And like I said, he passed away in 2018.
And his parents, were they able to join him when he came back from Europe?
They came back to California a few years later. But it's like his mother actually died, his birth mother died when he was very young. So it was a stepmother, actually. But yes, they did come back to the United States, but he never had a good relationship with his father after that.
I'm also curious about how his family felt being subjected to go to Mexico, and then now it's okay to go back to the United States. I mean, that can't feel very warm and fuzzy.
No, it wasn't. I mean, California did make light, and there have been certain laws enacted to help those, to recognize the experiences of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals who were repatriated. That's a whole other issue, but there's an excellent book by a historian who helped us with the History Unfolded module. It's called Decade of Betrayal. It's about the repatriation. Francisco Valderrama, he's a historian at UC Davis in California, in Southern California. I found out that my family had a history in this. And my grandparents actually did go to Mexico, even though they were both US citizens. And my grandfather was actually born in Spain, and my grandmother was born in Arizona, to parents who were Mexican immigrants. They went back to Mexico and I shouldn't even say back because they had never lived there. They went for 3 months and then were able to come back to the US because of the help of family members. But my great grandparents were encouraged to return to Mexico. And it was only through friends and my great aunts and uncles, their children, who said, they're not this, don't go. It's a trick, it's a ploy. So thankfully they did not go. But this is a whole history that, again, you can just Google Mexican repatriation and you will see interviews with Dr. Valderrama, and you'll see articles. It's been talked about on NPR, for example. And this is a history that we're learning about at the museum. Fortunately, for our Hispanic Heritage Month program, for our staff, Dr. Valderrama spoke to our staff and gave them a whole overview on this history. I moderated the discussion, and the majority of our staff knew nothing about it or knew very little about it. So this is how we look to expand on this history at the museum and look for those cultural connections that other groups might have toward this.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to say that when we interviewed Mr. Acevedo, we ourselves didn't even realize that that was part of his story. It wasn't until a few years ago that we realized, wait a minute, why was his family deported back? And we started to get information, but sadly, his health declined and he wasn't in a condition where we could conduct further interviews. So I'm talking to his sons because they knew the whole story about the repatriation angle. So hopefully, Eileen, by the time we work together in August, I'll have more information for you about that. So,
Christina, when is the short film going to be done?
It's in review right now. I think by September it should be done. I wanted to show a clip of it, but I was told no. But it is in the works and it is impressive. I reviewed it and had some comments because they had not included anything about him being Mexican-American. And I said, we have to include that. So they're going back and changing it.
Is it titled yet?
It's not, I don't know the title, but I know it's going to be about 8.5 minutes long. And it's from what I've seen, it's well done. It's very well done.
And it's going to be available to schools,
It'll be on our website. Okay. Yes. And we do have on the website, you can find his collection on our website. The diary is digitized. It's not on a particular web page, but it's in our collections. I can send the link to you, Scott. He's also featured in our Americans in the Holocaust website too. He's featured there, and he's also featured in our poster set that goes with American Witnesses. His story is also featured there. So he is featured in a few places on our website, and we do have his full collection digitized. We haven't transcribed his diary, but his handwriting is very clear, and if you can read cursive,
it's beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very, very, very good handwriting. I was an English teacher, and back then, we were all still writing. There were no tablets yet, so my students were writing, and his cursive you can read his diary very clearly.
Christina, it's my understanding that History Unfolded is just going to continue on and on. When I took over for Donna a few years ago, my understanding was that it was kind of a limited, we're doing this for X number of years and then it's over, but that has changed?
That has changed. And I just, every week I meet with Eric Schmaltz, who's the manager of History Unfolded, because we're always mapping out who we need to reach out to. And Eric and I worked with Dr. Valderrama for for the repatriation unit. So if you go to that unit online, you learn more of the history of the repatriation. We include it there. And History Unfolded, Eric told me the other day that it will probably go into 2023. We keep extending it because there are so many topics that we hope we can add. And there's so many more people that we would love to bring in. Because, you know, we don't have the staff and the capacity to be everywhere. I mean, that's why it's so great to work with our Czech partners, because you bring the regional history and teach us that history. And when you encourage the teachers and volunteers in your network, I mean, it's just, everybody has a part to play in collecting this history. And this is one way to help us do it.
Oh, that is good to know.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, scribbling notes.
No problem. Does anybody have any other questions? And thank you for the complimentary comments in the chat from Darlene and Saltzman. So I really appreciate that.
This just goes, I mean, please just jump in if you have a question, but I just am struck constantly how everything is connected. You know, how we're finding connections that, you know, we wouldn't have thought to find. And this is the way I think, is just that everything is connected. We just have to look deep enough.
Exactly. I mean, that's why we need more people researching this history, because they find these things. And for every Anthony Acevedo collection that we know about, you know, it is, using him as an example, there are so many more out there that we don't know about. Kira Schuster, who I think you might be meeting in November, hopefully in person, if not virtually. Kira, there were other men of Mexican descent who were also taken to Berga, and she's made connections with those family members. So hopefully we might receive more information, but it doesn't matter what the background. This is a way to connect with an audience that might not see itself in this history, but this is for everybody. We don't want to silo and say, oh, well, because you're a Japanese American, you should only learn this. No, this is really showing us who is an American, and the different contributions that Mexican Americans, Black Americans, anybody is making in the country. And it's very encouraging for those of us who are educators, or those of us who work with teachers, who are telling us, you know, that their students are more and more diverse every year. They're coming, you know, more and more students are coming from countries that are not of European, you know, not from Europe. They're coming from countries in the African continent, from Latin America, from, you know, regions that in many ways we haven't always reached out to, or we haven't learned about as much as we've learned about Europe. So, you know, the museum is very aware of that. And we collect, I mean, we've even done work in India and China to collect records from there.
Well, I mean,
are these stories a part of in the redesign and updating of the permanent exhibit? Is this going to be a part of that?
I know that we will probably feature something with History Unfolded. I hope, Scott, that's my big hope that it will be, but we are redesigning our permanent exhibition. And we haven't been able to do much with it because of the pandemic, but we're very aware of the fact that our audience is much more diverse than it was when we first opened, and that more likely than not, most of our visitors are not of European descent, but they're coming from other parts of the world. So I'm hopeful, and I imagine that it would be. I will say this, we have a traveling version right now of the Americans in the Holocaust exhibit, and we do feature some newspaper articles from Spanish language newspapers that were published in the United States at the time. And we do have a lesson plan from History Unfolded about the voyage of the St. Louis, featuring some of those newspaper articles in Spanish.
Interesting.
And
And
that is-
just to let everyone know, sorry, Kel, that exhibit will be coming to Nebraska, where every state is receiving it. It's going to be at Nebraska Wesleyan, which is close to here. And as soon as we have more information, obviously things were held up by COVID, we'll pass along, and we're hoping to be able to do some programming with that too.
Still just a little bit salty that we couldn't get it here, but
Yeah, we
hey,
tried to get it.
Lincoln is
Actually,
better than nothing.
Yeah, well, and actually the compliment was that they were trying to go to some area, they were told, so they're going to areas where there wasn't necessarily Holocaust education. So it was a compliment to us. That
Yeah,
we're
we chose to
doing
take
good.
that
We
we were
chose to
doing a
take
good
it.
job here in
We're doing a good
Omaha.
job.
And honestly, that is true. I mean, this exhibit, we're trying to take it to places that are where you don't have a Holocaust center, you don't have support for Holocaust education and programming, and you all have so much. But we also hope that, we can find other ways so that the exhibit will come to places that do have a robust programming for Holocaust education.
Yeah, and Sandy said in the chat in October
It is
21.
October.
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. Well, and this is just, of course, I had not heard about the repatriation. I had not heard about, the immigration quotas of 1924, none of this before I started working here. And has not been lost on me now that we are kind of fighting the fight against Holocaust distortion, historical distortion, how we have done that with our own American history, kind of erase some things or swept some things under the rug. Like right now, everybody's talking about the Tulsa race riots of 1921, which I had also not heard about until several years ago. And so every time something like this happens, I think, yep, it's all connected.
Exactly. One of the ways that I came to looking at the Holocaust, and there were a few ways, and they were all through family connection somehow, was that my mother, who I referenced before, growing up in San Diego during the war, her next door neighbor, who was also her best friend, they went to school together, was a young girl named Gracie. My mother was born in 1931, and so was Gracie. And Gracie's parents were from Japan. And my mother used to spend almost every day at Gracie's house, playing in their garden, which my mother said was very much in Japanese style. And she just felt like she was in this enchanted world every time she was at Gracie's house. And my mother and my grandmother spoke for the rest of their lives about when Gracie and her family were taken away to an internment camp. And she never stopped talking about Gracie and wondering what had happened to her. And thankfully, my mother passed away at the end of 2006. But in that last year of her life, I had gone to a conference and ended up sitting next to the director of education at the Japanese American Museum that's based in Los Angeles. And I told her this story. And my uncle was able to, he remembered the street address, and make a long story short, they found Gracie for us. And she and my mom spoke on the phone just before my mother passed away. So this is why it's just so important to have more people working on this history. And it meant the world to me to give that to my mom before she left us. But this is why these stories matter, because when you bring them to light, somebody will connect with them. And I know that you all are doing that in Nebraska. And I know that we are doing that, and that Eileen is doing it in Maryland, and Sandy and Donna, and everybody who has worked so actively in this. So just, continue to read. I put the name of the book.
Thank you, because I had misspelled the last name in my
Yeah.
notes, so I appreciate that.
Sure, and he's a darling man, Dr. Valderrama. He's become a friend and a real advocate for the museum. And he was stunned when I emailed him and I said, we're doing this. He was like, what? Like, and it was a struggle. There was some pushback because there was fears that we might be doing this as a response to what was happening on the border in the last few years. And no, it was like, we wanted, with our Americans in the Holocaust Initiative, we want our audiences to know the full scale of what was happening in the United States with segregation, with groups that were subject to racism, to lynching, to the anti-lynching laws that were never enacted, and just to understand what was the mood in the country and what was happening in the country that might impact how we looked at refugees, Jewish refugees who wanted to come here. So, this is providing a bigger context, what we want to do with a module like this and with Anthony Acevedo's story, is to add that layer of historical context. So
this is really exciting. For those of you who are our usuals, I will be sending out an email with all the links to the resources, to History Unfolded, and to Dr. Valderrama's book. And I'm assuming, Francisco Valderrama's book.
You said it, yes.
Yeah, and to the links for Anthony Acevedo's collections on the website, so that you have it all in one place.
Wonderful. Well, I have to run to a meeting at 1:30. But I just want to thank you again for this invitation. And I want to wish all of you the best. It's so good to see you all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much,
much.
Christina, for giving us your
Thank
time.
you. Anytime. It's a joy to
Oh,
work with
be
you.
careful what you offer.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, next month we have our local, Dr. Mark Gudgel will be speaking on his new book. And we look forward to everybody being with us again, hopefully next month.
June 17th, we'll send you a link.
Great.
Take care,
you all.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Sandy, good luck at
Thank
State
you,
Track.
Scott.
Yes. Good luck,
Nice to
Sandy.
see everybody.
Bye-bye. Eileen,
Thank
thank you.
you all.
Donna, good to
Bye,
see
thank
again.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks for letting me mute you, Jeff.